Hello, it's good to be here. How is everybody today? I was coming on the way here this morning, got in an accident. You know, what in the world causes somebody to stop right in front of you? If you'd say the red light, you'd be right. And I was right behind them, and I didn't see the red light. Thankfully everybody's okay. And I will learn to pay attention to the car, not just the light that's up there, or maybe the light, not just the car that's there. And so, but thank you for praying for me. It's one of those things, if you've ever been in a wreck, you look around to make sure there's nobody you know that sees you in an embarrassing situation with police lights all around you. There was Dina was right behind me, but we're fine. Their car's a little messed up. My car's fine in that. But you talk about things that happen at the worst possible time. In that I have either hit or been hit 2 times while I've been in Houston. One of them was on the way to church Wednesday night, and the other one was on the way to church Sunday morning. In there, and I'm thinking, come on, devil, you got to do better than that. But then I don't want him to do better than that. I want him to stick with just hurting the car. Take your message notes out. We're talking about how God turns setbacks into comebacks. Now, let me give you a rule of thumb. Let me give you a rule of life. Let's see if you agree with this. Which is easier to do, get in or get out? No, it's always easier to get into something than it is to get out of something. It's always easier to get into debt than it is to get out of debt. It's always easier to fall in love than it is to fall out of love. It's always easier to get into. It's always easier to make a commitment than it is to keep that commitment. Yet life is a marathon. Life is a series of getting ins and getting outs in that. And as time goes on, you know when a marathon starts? Have you ever seen a marathon start? They've got people lined up 4 or 5 miles back on the big marathons, and the bell goes off or the gun goes off, and people start running. And it may be 10, 15, 20 minutes before your group gets to start running because everybody's packed in there really tight. You get at about mile marker 20 on that marathon. And there's plenty of spaces between everybody then. It's still not all packed up together. And so at the start of life, it's always really crowded. But as the race of life progresses, you have fewer and fewer people that are out there, and it's a lot wider space between the runners. Because the thing is, as life goes on, life's not easy. Life starts getting difficult. And my goal during this season of turning setbacks into comebacks is to help you finish well. That as we go through life, finishing is the most important thing we can do. Now, because we all have setbacks, one of the greatest enemies to our spiritual maturity, since we all have setbacks, we all have a common enemy out there. And the common enemy we're going to talk about today is in the middle of our setback, as we're working toward the comeback, we get to meet Mr. Depression. And depression comes in and stops us in our tracks. And when depression comes in, we don't want to do what we were doing. What we want to do when depression comes in is go sit on the shelf. We want to sit this one out. We don't want to get in the game. The game's too hard. The game's kicked us out. The game's messed with our heads. The game has messed with our minds. And we're going to sit this one out and let somebody else play the game. When we have a setback, it does stuff to us. Now, discouragement is common, discouragement is powerful, discouragement is universal, discouragement is recurring. In fact, I imagine we've got some folks here that I just had a wreck that was my fault. You have a preacher that came to church discouraged this morning, and yet we've got that all through the auditorium. We've got some folks in here that are discouraged. You've had tough weeks. You've had tough months. You've had tough years. And you're wondering what to do next. Well, today we're going to look at a story that illustrates both the causes and the cures for discouragement, and it teaches us what to do when we feel like giving up and walking away. Now, the story we're going to talk about goes all the way back into the Old Testament to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 4. By the way, you say, how do I know if this is for me? Okay, here we're going to set this. If you're in middle school, if you're in high school, if you're a school teacher, if you're in college, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're an employee, if you're an employer, That pretty much gets all of us in here. If you're any one of those things, you need to study the book of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah is a book about leadership. Nehemiah is a book about management. And in the book of Nehemiah, the story is about rebuilding a city wall around Jerusalem. Now let me give you a little history. That God's people had turned away from God. And the result of God's people turning away from God is that God had given them over into captivity. Captivity is a nice word for slavery. He had given them over into slavery to a place called Babylon. And it was a city in what you and I would call Iraq. I did some looking on the atlas of where it was, and the city of Babylon was about 70 miles southwest of Baghdad. Now, in that city, they were held prisoner of war or slaves for 70 years. And after 70 years, they were allowed to return to Jerusalem. Now, when they got back to Jerusalem, Jerusalem was a mess. I mean, Jerusalem had lain in ruin, and it was a mess, and everything needed to be done. Every wall needed to be rebuilt. Every building needed to be restored. Everything was a mess. And so before they could rebuild the city, they had to go and rebuild the wall around the city, because they had to fortify it before they could work on the inside of it. If they built the inside of it first, people would walk through the wall or walk around the wall and tear down everything they'd built up. So the Bible says they started on the wall first. And it says that at the start, everybody started working hard. Everybody was excited. Everybody worked hard on the wall, and they built it to about half of its original height until about that time when the excitement wore off. And when the excitement wore off, they got discouraged. And they got discouraged for 4 particular reasons, 4 very common reasons. Now let's talk about those, and let's look at those reasons that they got discouraged in there. Let me get my page flipped here. It is not being cooperative. We're going to read out of the book of Nehemiah, and we're going to see if you can see yourself or see some of these things or all of these things in this reading. Nehemiah is narrating for us, chapter 4, verses 6 through 12. He says, so we rebuilt the wall around Jerusalem until it had reached half its original height, because the people worked at it with all of their heart. But then, okay, here's where it turns. But then the other tribes in our area heard about our progress, and how Jerusalem's walls were being repaired, and how all the gaps were being closed. And they became very angry, and they all plotted together to attack Jerusalem and to create some confusion in order to stop the progress. So we prayed to God for protection, and we posted 24-hour guards, but about that same time, the people of Jerusalem began to complain. Here's what they said. They said, we're tired and worn out, and we can't keep up this pace. Besides that, there's so much rubble and trash to be removed. We now realize that we cannot finish this wall. Meanwhile, our enemies are threatening to kill us in order to stop this work. Then those of us who lived closest to our enemies kept reporting over and over 10 times that our enemies kept saying, it doesn't matter where you go, we will attack you. Okay, now let's look at the 4 common causes of discouragement out of this passage and see what they did to turn a setback into a comeback. Now, I want you to see what happens first when discouragement sets in. Well, verse 6, it says, they worked hard on the wall, rebuilding until it reached about half its original height. Now, you might want to underline half its original height, because that's something that we need to look at, half of its original height. Because it's typical. Because discouragement doesn't happen in the first little bit, and discouragement doesn't happen as you're finishing up. Discouragement happens when you're right in the middle and you see how far you have to go before you're going to get to the end. Several years ago, a friend and I decided we're going to walk down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, 11 miles, all downhill. We're going to walk down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, spend the night down there, next morning walk back up. Man, I'm going to tell you something. When you leave the trailhead on that south rim of that Grand Canyon, you leave that trailhead, it's exciting because everybody's there. Maybe 50, 60 people all watching everybody leave. And, you know, the folks that are walking, we're all geared up. We've got our gloves. It's cold at the top. We've got our gloves. We've got our poles. We've got our special shoes and all that kind of stuff. And we step out there, and, man, you get claps. But go for it, baby. Go for it. And you're waving at everybody, and you're getting a hero's send-off. in there because you're going to do it. You're going to do this thing. And that lasts, you can hear that for about a mile. That's 11 miles down there, okay? And so you can hear that for about a mile. And you're getting along a pretty good clip because everybody's happy and you're happy. You get to about mile 4. And the 4th mile in there, you realize, oh, I still have 7 miles to go. And I'm tired. And I'm starting to get thirsty. And my feet are starting to hurt. And I've got 2 choices. I can either press on another 7 miles, or I could turn around, and it's 4 miles back. That's no win. You come across a sign that says a helicopter will come lift you out at $1,000, and you start remembering how much you have in your bank and whether or not they'll take a check, and if you even brought a check with you on that. Now, the next day, you get up in the morning, you walk a different trail that's also 11 miles up. And the first few miles that you're down on the bottom of the canyon, it's nice and flat, and it's nice that you get to a place called Indian Garden, and you stop at Indian Garden, and you fill up your canteens, and you do all this kind of stuff, and it's nice, you get your rest. But then you got to put your boots back on, and you have to walk that other 7 miles back up to the top of that. And the middle of that 7 miles, you get mighty discouraged because you've got folks that you can't see that are starting below you, and you can't see the finish line. All you know is you've got another 7 miles of walking up a rock. You've got another 7 miles of this. The problem was, what do you do with that time in the middle? 4 miles is a long way to go until you realize you have twice as many waiting for you on the other side. And you realize, man, this project, I don't know if I want to do this project, but I'm already so deep in this project that if I quit this project, it's either going to cost me $1,000 or I'm going to have to hike 4 miles in another direction and then get lifted up off of it. See, the middle point of the Grand Canyon is the worst place you can be, unless you've ever painted a house. If you ever painted a house on the inside, the worst place you could be when you're painting your house on the inside is about halfway done. Because when you get about halfway done, you got paint all over the place. You got your floor stuff down. You got paint all over the place. You still have a whole lot to do, and then the cleanup after that's over. And you've still got so much to do, and you're wishing you would have never started the process to begin with. And yet, you've got about halfway through, and you have to do it. Or halfway through your career. You're halfway through your career, you think, man, I've invested this many years into this part of this career, and in order to retire, I have to do this more many years in this career, and I don't know if I want to do it. Or halfway through your life, or halfway through your marriage. And that's when discouragement sets in. Sometimes we get discouraged in little areas. Sometimes discouragement sets in big areas. Now, in this story, we've got a really clear example of the 4 kinds of setbacks that caused discouragement. I want you to write them down. Number 1, here's what they are. When we get discouraged, when something takes longer when I expect it, when discouragement comes in, when we have a project in mind, and something takes longer than we expected. It causes fatigue. Now, in this story, the builders had worked really hard, and they're physically exhausted. And Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 10 says, we're tired and worn out. We can't keep up this pace. Okay, let me just say that. In a crowd this size, we've got some folks right there, right now. We've got some folks right there, right now. You don't know if you have anything else you can put out. And you still got a lot of work to go. Your preacher, father-in-law, kid's been in the hospital since January, and we've been involved. Every setback, every breakthrough that Ken's had, we've been there with him, Dina especially, in that, and that's taken a toll. You have this pie, and this much of this pie goes here, and this much of this pie goes here, and this much of this pie goes here, and before long, all our pie's gone, and there's no David and Dina pie, because it's all, and yet everything in there is legitimate. In that, and then we've had people that are good people, and some of them have been around a long time, and some of them haven't been around long enough, but nonetheless they're passing away. We look at that; they're passing away by the end of today, by 3 or 3:30 this afternoon. That Westbury will have played host to 3 funerals. By this afternoon. That's not including another person that passed away over the weekend that we'll have her funeral a little later on. If that hasn't been announced, it'll be announced on that. Somebody was a member of the church here for a long time. I know of a couple more that are just that aren't going to be much longer after that. And so you add all that up. You add everything like that up involved. I can think of here when things were at its highest with with Dina's father-in-law and trading places and having to do all this. When in an 80-hour period, we got 9 hours of sleep. And I want you to know something. Whenever you do that, your preacher the next morning was absolutely ineffective. I was worn out. I was worthless. I couldn't get anything done. Same thing with you. When you're tired, when you can't get anything done, when you're worn out, when you can't even think straight, that's the time when you're susceptible to depression. You don't know Frederick Taylor. Maybe some of you know Frederick Taylor. Maybe some of you want to look him up right now on your smartphone. Password is delivered. D-E-L-I-V-E-R-E-D. It's all lowercase. Frederick Taylor in 1893 did the first scientific study of work habits, and he proved that people accomplish more if they take regular rest breaks during the day. He discovered our best requires rest. I was reading, as I was preparing this lesson, about a particular type of a bat in Panama. There's lots of different kinds of bats, but there's this one bat in Panama whose heart beats normally at 1,000 to 1,500 beats a minute. And that bat can force themselves to slow down and lower their heartbeat to 200 beats per minute. And by being able to do that, that bat has a lifespan of over 20 years. See, most bats don't live that long. But he's been able to live that long because he's forced himself to relax. He's forced himself to lower his pulse. That's what rest does for us. You see, when we're tired, we get more vulnerable to all kinds of things. We get more vulnerable to attacks from other people and criticism. Deuteronomy 25:18, it says, never forget how the Amalekites attacked you when you were exhausted and weary, and they struck down those who began to lag behind. So when we get weary, when we get exhausted, when we get worn out, that leads to discouragement. Let me give you another kind of a setback that causes discouragement. We see that in the next parts of this verse, and it's when something is more complicated than we expected. Okay, it's when we find out something's more complicated. In other words, when you start on a project and discover that not only is it taking a lot longer than they said it would be, but it's a whole lot harder than they said it would be. You know, how long a project takes, man, that could cause some fatigue. How complicated the project is can cause frustration. And both fatigue and frustration are parts of the recipe for discouragement. You know, you see this, anybody have a file cabinet at home? Do you remember what those are, file cabinets? No, we have hard drives. But a file cabinet, this thing about like this, and it's just, you open it up, it's got files in there, and about once a year, all of us decide we're going to clean our file cabinets out. So we take our files and we put them on the desk, and once we get them on the desk, we see there's a lot of junk in there. There's a lot of stuff. Decide what goes, and after 3 or 4 hours, you think, this was crazy. You're just going to put them all back in there and try it again some other time because it's too complicated right now. You see, there were way too many decisions. I remember a few years ago, shortly after Dina and I got married, we decided that we were going to remodel our kitchen. We decided that we were going to put down new floors. Everything was going to be new carpet, going to be some wood laminate, going to be some new tiles. And I was amazed at how much garbage and how much trash was generated by ripping up some carpet and laying down some wooden tile. You see, here's the point. Anytime you try to build anything, whether it's a career, a plan, a project, a life, a hobby, a family, a marriage, you're going to have some debris. And it's frustrating because it always takes longer than we expect, and it's always much more complicated than we expect because of all that junk laying around. So that's the second setback the people of Jerusalem had when they were trying to rebuild the wall. Not only was it taking too long, but there was a whole lot of rubble. There was a whole lot of junk that was there. Nehemiah 4:10. There's so much rubble and trash to be removed. Now, you may not realize it, but every single one of us in this room, we've got some rubble in our lives. We've got some junk piles back there. We've got some trash that needs to be taken out. Every single one of us. It could be emotional rubble. It could be spiritual rubble. It could be relational rubble. We've got too many things in our life that we need to simplify down. Let me give you something that isn't on your outline. Okay, you don't have to write it down if you don't want to. You can listen to the CD, or you can just make a few notes, whatever you want to do. I'm going to call them Dave's Rules of the Rubble. All right, Dave's Rules of the Rubble. Here you go. Let me give you, there's 4 of them, okay? Here it goes. Number 1, rubble is a part of life. Do not try to outdistance it. It's a part of life. In other words, you cannot avoid it. You're going to have piles of emotional trash in your life. Number 2, by the way, the bigger your pile, the more frustrated you're going to get. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, Dave's Rules of Rubble number 2, you've got to periodically clean it out of your life. Do you know what happens if you decide one day, I'm not going to take out the garbage. I'm going to leave it underneath the sink. I'm just going to decide because you know it's garbage and it's garbage and garbage is garbage and it's never going to be any good, and I'm not even going to bother taking it out. Well, after about a week or two, depending on what time of the year here, after a day or two, it's going to smell pretty bad. And it's going to stay smelling bad till you take it out. So we've got to take out the emotional garbage, the emotional rubbish in our lives. Yeah, and we do that when we confess it to God. Number 3, if we don't deal with it, eventually it will take over. If we don't deal with the rubbish in our life, it'll take over. Have you ever noticed how trash amplifies, how trash multiplies when you don't deal with it? Like dishes in the sink. You go to bed and there are 2 dishes in the sink. You wake up the next morning, it has multiplied. There are 10 dishes in the sink. And it just does that by itself. All right? It just multiplies. Rule number 4. You don't always recognize what is rubble in your life, but other people do. And sometimes it takes an expert to point out the rubble because we get so used to the rubble in our life that we don't see it anymore. So the question is, let's get real personal, okay? What's the rubble in your life? Since everybody's got it, since everybody's got these little neat stacks, what is the rubble in your life? It's the stuff that keeps tripping us up. All right, here's the 3rd setback that'll cause us to be discouraged, and that is when I begin doubting my own ability. When I start to doubt my own ability, okay? We've got fatigue because it's taken too long. We've got frustration. We've got, and when we add those in, we start having a sense of failure, and now it gets serious. Nehemiah 4:10, the people said, we now realize that we cannot, all right, they didn't say we realize that we will not. We now realize that we cannot finish this wall. Oh, what just happened? Something big just happened, okay? Because all of a sudden they've decided they can't finish it. They've lost their confidence. You ever lost your confidence on something, man? They've lost their confidence. They've decided, look, we just can't do this anymore. They've got self-doubt, and they're questioning as to why they even started. Now, let me just stop here and ask a really serious question. How do we handle failure? Because we're going to have a whole lot more of those than we're going to have successes in our lives. But how do we handle failure? How do we react when our plans that we spent so much time creating, how do we handle it when those plans collapse? How do we react when something takes longer than we thought it was going to take? How do we take it when something is more complicated than we thought it was going to be and we start doubting? We start wondering if we even have the ability to do this. Listen, here's a proverb, okay? I'm going to give it to you. If at first you don't succeed, If at first you don't succeed, you are normal. Rarely do we succeed on the first time. Successful people just see failure as a temporary setback. This whole series is going to be learning the spiritual quality of resilience, and trusting God for a comeback. Because remember, you can't have a comeback without a setback. Now finally, there's a 4th checkup when we start to give up, and that is when the opposition grows stronger. Here's the deal. You start a project. You start a project, and it may just be a little small project, something nobody even cares about, but you start a project. And the moment you start being effective with your project, the opposition is going to start coming in. I mean, the moment you put a shingle out and say, I'm open for business, somebody's going to start throwing rocks at your shingle. And when you get rocks thrown at you, it gets you afraid. So far, we've got a combination of fatigue, frustration, failure, and fear. Now, that's enough to discourage anybody. Nehemiah 4:11 says this, meanwhile, and in spite of those three facts, the fact that it's taken too long, it's too complicated. It's taken too long, it's too complicated, we don't know what we're doing, we doubt our ability. It says, meanwhile, our enemies are threatening to kill us in order to stop this work. All right, this is a legitimate reason to be discouraged, okay? A legitimate reason to be discouraged is, if we finish this product, we might die. All right? Those of us who live closest to our enemies kept reporting over and over and over 10 times, it doesn't matter where you go, we will attack you. Now, I want you to listen really closely to this, okay? Because if you're discouraged, if we insist on living a life on a diet of negative people, negative talk, negative radio, negative cable, guess what? If we insist on that being our diet, that is going to infect us with fear. I believe some need to go on a brain diet and stop filling our hearts and our minds with so much negative. See, let me ask you a personal question. Well, the personal question is this. What secret fear is causing us to be discouraged this morning? We've got discouraged folks here. So what's God's cure when we feel like giving up, when we get halfway through something? What's the cure for that God gives us? Look at Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. Be confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to the day of completion in Jesus Christ. You see, they were ready to give up. They were in a setback. So what did Nehemiah do to turn the setback into a comeback? Nehemiah did three things. Number one, he reorganized what was not working. Sometimes when things stop working for us, we tell ourselves we must be doing the wrong thing. And God says, no, you're doing the right thing. You're just doing it the wrong way. You're doing the right thing. You need to be doing it differently. Nehemiah 4:13, I stationed armed guards at the most vulnerable places of the wall, and I assigned people by families with their swords and lances and our bows. Nehemiah said, listen, we're doing the right thing. We're guarding the wall. We just got to change the way we're guarding the wall. Number two, refocus on God. Nehemiah 4:14. Then Nehemiah said, I looked over the situation. I called together the leaders of the people, and I said to them, don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord who is great and glorious. You know, we can be so busy doing the Lord's work for the Lord that we forget to let God work in us. We can be so busy out doing the Lord's work that we forget to let the Lord come to us. So we refocus on God and recommit ourselves to Jesus Christ and do that often so we can keep the main thing the main thing. Then third is to resist discouragement. 4:14, fight for your brothers. These are people who wanted to give up. Fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and wives and homes. He says, don't you dare give up without a fight. Let me tell you something. We are in a spiritual battle every single day of our lives. We are not in a playground. The world is not a playground. It is a battleground. You know, the difference between great people and ordinary people is that great people simply refuse to be defeated. Great people are ordinary people with an extraordinary amount of determination. I am not that smart, y'all. I am not that talented. But one thing that I have learned is that I do not know how to quit, and I don't give up even when it all goes wrong. And if God wants to use you, if God's going to use you the way he wants to use you, you're going to be used, and you're going to be used the way God wants to use you, then you cannot give up on God even when you're fatigued, even when you're frustrated, even when you're fearful, even when you feel like you're failing. You just choose to keep on going. If you find yourself in Earth's version of hell, you just keep on going. If you find yourself stuck in the ditch, you just keep on going. If you find yourself halfway to the place you want to be, you just keep on going. And your setback becomes a comeback because you did not quit. Most of us quit too soon. Most of us stop too soon. Well, I want to invite you to go the distance. I want to invite you to go the distance with Jesus Christ today. He went the distance for you. So now we're just operating off of example. He's not asking you to do anything he's not already done. He went the distance for you. Go the distance for him. He gave his life for you. Give your life for him. Be baptized this morning. Come home to the Lord's church if you've walked away. Place your membership here. But be moving in the right direction. Just a small step at a time. And make him the difference between the setback and the comeback. And the comebacks will continue to keep coming. If he will be the difference. Please think on that. And come while we stand.